Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my top 24 wide receiver rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Now, yesterday on my early round draft strategy video, I mentioned the fact that currently on Underdog Fantasy Best Ball drafts, we're witnessing about 8 wide receivers being selected in just the first round alone on average. Now, when I was going ahead and collecting all the statistics and facts that I'm going to share with you on today's episode, it really comes to no surprise that so many have confidence in the wide receiver position, considering how much elite level talent there is at the very top of the position that have shown consistency year over year. Additionally, with wide receivers who are young up and coming players who are rising stars who can join them in that elite level of opportunity and production, it really comes to no surprise. So as I'll share with you guys the statistics and facts that I've gathered over the last off season, hopefully, I'll lead you to the most informed decisions as you approach your 2023 fantasy football drafts. Before we get into today's content, a reminder for those of you who are trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings, because again, this video is being recorded and posted on August 3rd. Between now and the beginning of the season, there could be a lot of variables changed and these rankings could change. So if you're trying to stay up to date, be sure to subscribe to the channel. The goal for this season is to get to 100,000 subscribers. So if you can help us get there, of course, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season. Later tonight at about 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, I'll be live streaming here on the channel. So for those of you who are interested, potentially getting some advice, drafting alongside me via Underdog, you can go ahead and join us then. Speaking of drafting via Underdog, for those of you who go ahead and use the link down in the description of the video and travel to their website and use promo code Andrew today, not only are you going to be able to potentially draft with me later tonight after you make that first time deposit, you're also going to get my 2023 fantasy football draft guide and rankings this offseason with weekly updates to those rankings that'll help you no matter when you're drafting this August. Additionally, you will also get my 2023 fantasy football weeks 1 through 18 rankings every Sunday morning emailed to you, which have positional rankings by tier at quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, flex in half and full PPR scoring formats. So help me help you going into the 2023 season so we can help you capture a 2023 fantasy football championship. Of course, for those of you who are wondering what my 2023 fantasy football draft guide looks like, these are just some of the pages. I put a lot of effort and a lot of work into this. So for those of you who are trying to get an upper hand on your league, be sure to go ahead, travel to Underdog, use promo code Andrew, and make sure you make that first time deposit minimum of $10. To know if you're eligible, utilize the map on the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility and draft responsibly. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about my top 24 wide receivers going into the 2023 season, beginning with Justin Jefferson. It really shouldn't be a surprise. I shouldn't have to sell Justin Jefferson to you. He has sold himself based on his production levels in the first 3 seasons of his career. Amongst all wide receivers in National Football League history, he has the most targets, receptions, and receiving yards amongst all wide receivers in the first 3 years of a career. Unbelievable numbers he has put forth. Not only that, he continues to improve every season. Obviously, last year becoming the number 1 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. In the last 3 seasons, with Kirk Cousins under center, when of course, we have seen Justin Jefferson play 75% or more percentage of the snaps. The guy's averaging 17.95 half PPR fantasy points per game. Additionally, when he has been given elite levels of opportunity, especially last season, there were 11 instances where Justin Jefferson was given 10 or more targets. In those games, averaging 23.88 fantasy points per game. Again, that's 65% of the time last season where he was given 10 or more opportunities in terms of targets. Fantastic numbers, especially considering the fact that last season, the Minnesota Vikings targeted their wide receiver position the second most times amongst all teams in the National Football League. So elite level opportunities there. The team is bought in. The quarterback play is good enough. Everything looks fantastic for Justin Jefferson approaching 2023. I think the only question at hand is whether or not he's going to be able to capture the Triple Crown this year, because last season he set career highs in targets, receptions, and receiving yards. Touchdowns eluded him despite the fact that the opportunity was there last season in the red zone. He had the second most targets inside the 20-yard line amongst all players in the National Football League, only behind Travis Kelce, and he tied Travis Kelce in terms of targets inside the 10-yard line with 19. Of course, Justin Jefferson did have a little bit of inconsistency last year with 5 performances out of his 17, which obviously were less than 5 fantasy points in those contributions. I think he'll be able to clean that up and again, capture the number 1 overall spot in terms of fantasy football. All right, moving on. Let's talk about our number 2. I know there's a lot of questions regarding the health of Cooper Kupp, considering he left practice the other day with a hamstring injury. He's getting up there in age. That could certainly be a deterrent as to whether or not you're going to draft him this offseason. That all being mentioned, you got to remember just how good Cooper Kupp is and the fact that the Los Angeles Rams do not ever play their starters in the preseason. So the fact that he could miss the next couple weeks and then not play in the preseason does not scare me because they never do. Therefore, he will be healthy for the beginning of the season. And when he is given the opportunity from Matthew Stafford, he's unstoppable. Again, the last time we saw him healthy from weeks 1 through 9 of the 2022 season, the guy was averaging 20.31 half PPR fantasy points per game and was the number 1 overall wide receiver in terms of fantasy points per game throughout that span of time. Again, don't forget, this is a Triple Crown winner in 2021, a Super Bowl MVP, someone that if you go ahead and take his 2022 pace of play and expand that upon 17 healthy games, he would have easily been the number 1 overall fantasy wide receiver with 345 fantasy points. When you go ahead and include playoff games to his overall resume of games from 2021 through 2022, he's averaging 21.67 fantasy points per game in the last 29 contests that he's participated in. Elite levels of opportunity in terms of 10 plus targets are not shy of Cooper Kupp. They are pretty much hand in hand every single game. The fact of the matter is he's consistent. He's getting about, I think, a target percentage in terms of targets per routes run, 29 to 31% over the last couple of years. In terms of his catch rate, in 2021, 76%. Last season, nearly 77%. On top of the fact that his consistency is demonstrated that in the last, 29 games that he has played, including the playoffs, 24 of those games have been 15 or more fantasy points, and only one of them less than 10 fantasy points. Incredible production for Cooper Kupp going into 2023. Let's talk about Tyreek Hill. Again, he's got a very high ceiling, and based on what we saw in 2023 with the Miami Dolphins, he's got a really high floor. Now, we've seen consistency of play from Tyreek Hill, and we thought, okay, sure, maybe we'll go ahead and see a little bit of a lesser version of him considering Tua was at quarterback, but he went ahead and set career highs in targets, receiving yards, and receptions last season as a member of the Miami Dolphins. This is a wide receiver that in 4 out of the last 5 seasons has been a top 6 fantasy ranked wide receiver. The only season in which he wasn't able to accomplish a top 6 standing was in 2019. He missed a couple games due to injury in that season. Last year, in the games in which he played with Tua Tagovailoa, where Tua was not concussed and was fully healthy, so that basically excludes weeks 3, 4, and 16. When playing with Tua, Tyreek Hill was averaging 20.00 half PPR fantasy points per game, and those weren't rare instances. Again, that's were 10 games out of his entire season last year. 7 of those games with Tua, 10 plus targets, averaging 21.61 fantasy points per game. I absolutely believe that this offense with Mike McDaniels joining them as their head coach play caller completely shifted everything around. They targeted their wide receiver position the 5th most times amongst all teams in the National Football League last year, which of course you'll have to do with talent like Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle, both guys that should be top 12 options in this given season. Last year, with Tua under center in the 10 games they played together, in terms of targets per route run, Tyreek Hill was being targeted on 36.25% of the routes that he was running. An incredible number. And even though last season many of you guys doubted my intel in terms of the stats that I collected in regards to how good Tua was in terms of deep passing stats, once again Tua proves all the haters wrong, as he was number 1 amongst all quarterbacks with 25 minimum passing attempts, 20 or more yards down the field, as he achieved the highest adjusted passing completion percentage on those passing attempts, while of course Tyreek Hill led the National Football League in terms of targets, receptions, and receiving yards, in terms of targets 20 or more yards down the field. An elite level talent with Tyreek Hill going into another year where he should be fantastic. Let's move on to Ja'Marr Chase. Now, in comparison to Cooper Kupp and Tyreek Hill, I do believe objectively Ja'Marr Chase is a safer option, specifically because Cooper Kupp's quarterback Matthew Stafford, obviously season-ending injury last year. Of course, we saw Tua get shut down late last season because of the concussions. We know that Joe Burrow is currently dealing with a calf injury, but that's a little bit different in comparison. I do believe that Ja'Marr Chase is inherently safer, but I don't know if he has the ceiling of production in comparison to those other two. Therefore, I have him at number 4. Just like Justin Jefferson, Ja'Marr Chase has improved every single season of his career thus far. His rookie year had an average of 7.75 targets per game that led to 16.28 fantasy points per game. You go to year 2, averaging 11.17 targets per game, which is an elite level of opportunity. Additionally, with 16.58 fantasy points per game. If he continues to improve like Justin Jefferson has in his career, he continues to see more opportunities with elite level quarterback play from Joe Burrow. Of course, the sky's the limit for Ja'Marr Chase. In the last 2 years, when he's been given 8 or more targets within this offense, he's averaging 18.43 fantasy points per game. When you're associated with an offense that targeted their wide receivers the 6th most times amongst all teams in the National Football League last year, if he's going to make strides of improvement once again, inherently he is a safer option. So if you're just trying to go ahead and retain someone that could be a top 5 option, Ja'Marr Chase is that. Can he get to these elite levels of opportunity and production like Cooper Kupp, Tyreek Hill? Again, with T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd garnering as many targets as they do every season, in comparison to someone like Ja'Marr Chase is going to have to get to 180, 190 targets if he wants to compete at those higher levels, which I'm not sure they're going to give them that level of opportunity in 2023. We can hope so, but I don't think it'll happen. Moving on, let's talk about Stefon Diggs. The level of consistency he has demonstrated is obvious. The last 3 seasons since joining the Buffalo Bills has been the number 4, 7, and 3 ranked wide receiver. Last season had an incredible overall boost of play where he averaged 16.41 fantasy points per game in the 16 games he played for the Bills during the regular season. Again, he is a stud wide receiver. He's associated with an offense that wants to throw the ball, targeted their wide receivers the 8th most times last season. He's associated with Josh Allen, who each of the last 3 seasons has had a minimum of 4,200 passing yards and 35 passing touchdowns. I don't really care what this offense does in terms of personnel. You bring in Dalton Kincaid. You run a lot of 12 personnel. You have a new running back in Damian Harris, Latavius Murray. You might want to run the ball more. It doesn't really matter. It's not going to affect Stefon Diggs' overall pace of play because Gabriel Davis did not develop into the player we thought he would, and Stefon Diggs is still going to garner himself a boatload of opportunity. So whether it's a 5-yard slant that goes to the house or, a 40-yard bomb down the field that scores a touchdown over the New England Patriots, doesn't really matter. Stefon Diggs can run any route in the route tree. He's getting elite levels of opportunity, and he has demonstrated over the last 3 seasons, averaging 15.64 fantasy points per game in 48 contests with the Buffalo Bills, that he deserves to be a top 5 option going into 2023. Moving on, let's talk about A.J. Brown, who had an incredible year in 2022, obviously joining his best friend in Jalen Hurts with the Philadelphia Eagles. We saw A.J. Brown take another step forward, setting career highs in targets, receptions, receiving yards, and fantasy points scored, averaging 15.04 fantasy points per game in the 17 regular season games he participated in last season, when he's been given elite levels of opportunity in the form of 8 or more targets that happened 10 times last season, averaging 19.17 half PPR fantasy points per game. This offense for the Philadelphia Eagles took a giant leap forward. They went from 2021 not having a single receiving option with 1,000 or more receiving yards to this last season having 2 different receivers achieve that. The fact that this team went from the bottom 3 in terms of wide receiver targets in the entire season in 2021 compared to top 10 in 2022 is a huge undertaking, but they were able to all step up their level of play and of course help A.J. Brown achieve these incredible feats of fantasy production. As we approach the 2023 season, we're talking about someone who had 2.59 yards per route run last season. That was 3rd amongst all receiving options last year. Had the 6th most yards after the catch with 565, and had the 4th most air yards amongst all wide receiver options with 1,754. I honestly think that A.J. Brown is just going to continue to get better. He's a young wide receiver in an offense that wants to throw the ball deep. Of course, we know how good he is as a deep receiving option. Don't forget, Jalen Hurts was number 3 amongst all quarterbacks in terms of deep passing touchdowns, 20 or more yards down the field. He had 11 of them, 7 of them going in the direction of A.J. Brown. As long as this offense continues to maintain their elite level, fantasy points should be easy for him. Moving on, let's talk about our number 7 through 12, beginning with CeeDee Lamb. CeeDee Lamb with the Dallas Cowboys had his first season where he had no Amari Cooper, so he was the de facto number 1 overall option within this offense. And when you include his 2022 season, all 19 games he participated in, including the playoffs, averaged 14.75 fantasy points per game. But when you go ahead and isolate the games in which he played with Dak Prescott, from week 7 through 18, averaged 16.1 half PPR fantasy points per game, 11 games throughout that span, and was the number 3 overall fantasy option in terms of total points scored and fantasy points per game at the wide receiver position throughout that span of time. So again, the opportunities there with the right quarterback, he is going to be an incredible option, and that has been demonstrated over the last couple of years, but it took an extra step last season because of the absence of Amari Cooper having been traded to the Cleveland Browns. So as we approach this upcoming season, where are the doubts? Why aren't we expecting CeeDee Lamb to have an incredible season? We are. The only difference is going to be whether or not the offensive coordinator change is going to make a difference. So this offseason, we're going from Kellen Moore to Brian Schottenheimer. Of course, Kellen Moore has helped this offense achieve top 7 statistics in terms of all wide receiver opportunity stats since 2019. That's targets, receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns. Now you go to Brian Schottenheimer, who the last time he was an offensive coordinator for the team was the Seattle Seahawks from 2018 through 2020. And those wide receiver options within that team didn't get many opportunities, but they were able to deliver, whether that was Tyler Lockett or DK Metcalf overall. I think going into this upcoming season, the way that they're going to potentially continue to utilize CeeDee Lamb as a slot receiving option last season amongst all receivers was number 3 in terms of targets from the slot position amongst all receivers, number 2 in receptions, number 1 in receiving yards, and number 11 in receiving touchdowns. If you continue to get him opportunities, which he certainly will, considering the target vacancy going into 2023 for this offense, considering there's no Schultz, there's no Noah Brown, there's no T.Y. Hilton, there's no Zeke, that's 195 targets up for grabs. And sure, Brandon Cooks will take some, but definitely not all of them. Let's move on to Davante Adams, our number 8. Davante Adams is going to be a little bit tricky because he has shown a level of consistency, and the fact that he is probably one of, if not the best receivers in the National Football League. In 4 out of the last 5 seasons, Davante Adams has been a top 3 fantasy wide receiver. The only season in which he wasn't able to accomplish that was 2019, where he was injured for a couple games, missed 4 games throughout that span of time with Green Bay. Outside of that, this guy has been incredible. Last season, achieved career highs in terms of targets with 180 and receiving touchdowns with 14. Incredible numbers. Obviously, with Derek Carr, his former college quarterback, they already had the rapport. They built upon it, and he had himself a fantastic season, averaging 16.79 half PPR fantasy points per game. Now, the question is going to be, can this offense continue that level of pace and continue to find that level of success with Jimmy Garoppolo taking the quarterback reps? Without Derek Carr there now, can Jimmy Garoppolo elevate this offense and allow Davante Adams to continue to maintain his high level of fantasy production every single season? Again, this is a wide receiver that last year, in terms of targets per route run, was targeted 29% of the routes that he ran. He was number 1 amongst all wide receivers in terms of air yards with 2,129 yards at the category. But again, like I mentioned, had 180 targets, but he only had a 55.56% catch rate. I think Jimmy G can help him get to that next level. And even though Davante Adams was a machine in terms of deep receiving game, and yes, Jimmy Garoppolo isn't the best deep passing quarterback, I think this offense is going to accentuate what Davante Adams does best, and they'll be able to get him the ball. When we look at the amount of opportunities that Jimmy Garoppolo has sent towards his best receiving options over the last couple of years, specifically the years in which he's been healthy, 2019 and 2021, he targeted Deebo Samuel 121 times in 2021. He targeted Kittle 107 times in 2019. He can find himself a number 1 receiving option. I just don't know if Davante Adams can get back to being 180 targets. He doesn't really have to be. As long as he's efficient and he has a higher catch rate, he'll be perfectly fine within this offense. Let's move on to Garrett Wilson, one of these rising stars that absolutely should be taking over the league. Last season, he put up the 16th best rookie wide receiver performance of the last decade. A decent season, averaging 10.25 fantasy points per game. 10.25 doesn't really move the needle, but the fact of the matter is, when you get Aaron Rodgers as your starting quarterback and you saw what Garrett Wilson could accomplish with just average quarterbacks last season, it kind of makes a difference. Last season, when Joe Flacco or Mike White were under center, in the 8 games in which Garrett Wilson played with them, he averaged 14.23 fantasy points per game. While on the other side of the coin with Zach Wilson under center, he averaged a mere 6.71 fantasy points per game in the 9 contests they played together. If you get Garrett Wilson, along with Aaron Rodgers, with a Nathaniel Hackett-led offense. Again, you're reuniting Aaron Rodgers with his favorite offensive coordinator. They, of course, were on the same team in 2019 through 2021 with the Green Bay Packers. When you reunite those 2 options, we have a perfect recipe of success. Let's not forget, Aaron Rodgers has been able to support 2 stud wide receivers nearly every single season of his career. When you look at averages from 2008 to 2002, the number 1 overall wide receiver of an Aaron Rodgers-led offense typically averages 131 targets, 86 receptions, 1,186 receiving yards, and 10 receiving touchdowns. Pretty incredible stats. While the number 2 of said offense averages 91 targets, 57 receptions, 800 yards, and 7 touchdowns. You can still have an ecosystem here of receivers, whether it's Allen Lazard or McCole Hardman, Corey Davis, who can find themselves success, all while Garrett Wilson is going to be a monster option in fantasy football this year. Again, last year, in the games in which he had 5 or more receptions, the guy was averaging 16.46 fantasy points per game. I can almost guarantee Aaron Rodgers is going to be littering him with opportunities, and when he does, he's going to be a fantastic option. Let's move on to Amon-Ra St. Brown, the thumbnail of today's video. You guys know how much I love Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's probably one of my favorite, if not my favorite receiver in the league as of this current moment in time. And the fact of the matter is, he has demonstrated a level of play which could justify the fact that he could be a top 5 wide receiver going into the 2023 year. I mean, a lot of us remember his, antics at the end of the 2021 season from weeks 13 through 18, where he averaged nearly 21 fantasy points per game and won many of us fantasy championships. He continued that pace of play from weeks 1 through 3 of the 2022 season prior to his injury, averaging 20.53 half PPR fantasy points per game. And once he returned from the injury, he obviously wasn't the same player from weeks 8 through 18, average only 13.5 fantasy points per game. But if you can find a healthy Amon-Ra St. Brown for an entirety of a season, a guy who continues to see a high level of opportunity with Jared Goff in an offense that really turned it around last season and targeted their receivers the 10th most times amongst all teams in the National Football League, when the opportunity is knocking, Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to deliver. A guy that literally had a target rate in terms of targets per route run of 30.02% last season. if you take into account that there's a target vacancy of no TJ Hawkinson, no Jamal Williams, no DJ Chark this season, Jamison Williams has been suspended for the first 6 games of the season. I mean, Amon-Ra St. Brown in the first 2 seasons of his career, without TJ Hawkinson in the lineup, is averaging already 16.25 fantasy points per game. If you take into account the fact that there isn't anybody else to compete with targets with him, he should be dominating all season long. And in my mind, could very easily outproduce the number 10 overall spot in terms of fantasy production at the wide receiver position. Moving on, Jaylen Waddle is our number 11. So here's the thing about Jaylen Waddle. Similar to the conversation we had about Tyreek Hill, when these wide receivers have played with a healthy Tua, they have been incredible. Again, last season with a healthy Tua, Jaylen Waddle averaged 14.87 fantasy points per game in those 10 contests. On a full healthy season rate in which Tua is there for all 17 games, we could have seen Jaylen Waddle produce 253 fantasy points and be the number 6 overall fantasy wide receiver in terms of averages. Pretty incredible production. This is a wide receiver who, again, is garnering a lot of targets and isn't going to have to see number 1 coverage. When Tyreek Hill quite literally is going to take double coverage, if not triple coverage, on every single play, Jaylen Waddle has the ability to roam freely and be a dominant option. And even though his rookie season, it was a bunch of targets very close to the line of scrimmage, they continue to expand his game. Last season, Tua improved his average depth of target from 7.4, which ranked 36 amongst all quarterbacks, to 10.1, which is second amongst all quarterbacks in 2022, with a minimum of 150 total passing attempts. Now, when we look at how that influenced Jaylen Waddle's overall production, going from a average depth of target in 2021, his rookie season, of 7.0 yards to 12.2 last season, of course, the quarterback play is going to influence an even greater production from someone like Jaylen Waddle, who, of course, whenever he's given 7 or more targets from 2021 through 2022 with Tua under center, the guy's averaging 17.19 fantasy points per game. The final thing I wanted to mention in regards to Waddle's potential in 2023 is the fact that since 2018, we have seen 22 different teams have 2 wide receivers exist within the top 24 rankings by season's end. Now, 7 of those teams had 2 wide receivers exist in the top 12 together. Of course, one of them being last season's Miami Dolphins. In order to be able to accomplish that level of success, the quarterbacks that have supported 2 top 12 wide receivers on average had about 4,600 passing yards and 32 passing touchdowns. If you take Tua's 10 healthy games last year, hear me out, his 10 healthy games where he wasn't concussed and he was healthy, the guy was on pace for 5,001 passing yards and 39 passing touchdowns. Just throwing it out there. I mean, just take it for what you will. There's a lot of potential for Jaylen Waddle to repeat as a wide receiver 1 in 2023. Moving on to the final wide receiver, another one of these young players that going into his second year here should have a huge uptick of production because of the quarterback play that we are going to witness. Last season, Chris Olave produced the 21st ranked rookie wide receiver performance of the last decade. Again, pretty good overall production. He could have been significantly better if the quarterback play from Andy Dalton was, a little bit. I mean, honestly, if they just went back to Jameis Winston, we would have saw far more potential from Chris Olave, considering how well he has played in terms of a deep passing receiving threat and how much Jameis Winston loves to throw the ball down the field, regardless of whether he's throwing picks. Either way, Chris Olave averaged 10.81 fantasy points per game in the 15 contests he played last season. If you take into account the fact that he was 6th amongst all receiving options in air yards, and now you're getting Derek Carr in this offense who loves to throw the ball deep and helped, of course, Davante Adams achieve incredible numbers in the deep receiving game, which included 9 receiving touchdowns in that category in terms of targets 20 or more yards down the field. Derek Carr last season was 4th overall in terms of quarterback passing attempts, 20 or more yards down the field. If and when they give Chris Olave these opportunities, he's going to be incredible. And I know, Rashid Shaheed, Michael Thomas, they still coexist within this offense, but Chris Olave is a different breed. And what I see him accomplishing this upcoming season is going to look very similar to what Derek Carr's number 1 receiving options has done in each of the last 4 seasons. The reason why I mentioned that is because let's go over that. In 2019, Darren Waller, 117 total targets, 90 receptions. If you were going to rank him as a wide receiver, would have been the number 24 ranked wide receiver in that season. 2020, Darren Waller, 145 targets, 107 receptions, would have ranked as the number 8 overall wide receiver in that season. Hunter Renfrow in 2021, 128 targets, 103 receptions, the number 11 overall ranked wide receiver. And then we have Davante Adams last season, of course, 180 targets, 100 receptions, number 3 overall ranked wide receiver. So that means in each of the last 3 years, Derek Carr has supported a receiving option that, if they counted as a wide receiver, of course, the one that wasn't was Darren Waller, have been top 12 options every year. I think Chris Olave could very easily accomplish that this upcoming season. Moving on, let's talk about our number 13 through 18 ranked wide receivers. Beginning with our number 13, we have Calvin Ridley. I love Calvin Ridley. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. Calvin Ridley, since joining the league, since coming out of Alabama and being such a touchdown-heavy machine in the early days of the Atlanta Falcons, going to 2020 and being the number 1 overall guy there and absolutely dominating. If you guys don't remember how good Calvin Ridley was, in 2020, he was not only the number 4 overall wide receiver in terms of a half PPR scoring format. The guy had 90 receptions, 1,374 receiving yards, and 9 receiving touchdowns, averaging 16.5 fantasy points per game that season. An incredible overall fantasy talent, to say the very least. And I understand he was suspended all of last year. And in 2020, the guy only played a handful of games. And it's been a while since we have seen Calvin really put together a high level of production considering that suspension. But once you go ahead and you implement him into an offense with a young up-and-coming quarterback who is going into his 3rd year, and we all know, and I'll present later on this offseason in an upcoming video, the next level step that quarterbacks take going into their 3rd year. A lot of these quarterbacks who get elite level wide receiver help additionally take an even further step. Calvin Ridley is going to help unlock Trevor Lawrence, especially considering there are so many targets that are vacant within this offense. You talk about Arnold, Manhurts, and Marvin Jones Jr. freeing up about 102 targets. The fact that we're not going to see Zay Jones get another 121 target year. It's very likely that Christian Kirk also sees some regression with his 133 targets. If we can get the ball in the direction of Calvin Ridley 130, 140 times, which is very easily in the realm of possibility going into this upcoming season, as a wide receiver who's going to predominantly play on the outside back in 2020, played 88% of his offensive snaps out wide, while last season Christian Kirk played 75% of his total snaps in the slot position. We're not going to really see them dig into each other's works in terms of snap counts, which will open up this offense even more as a heavy passing threat. I believe Calvin Ridley's potential is extremely high within this Jacksonville offense. From what we were able to witness from these other lower level wide receivers, if you just plug a fantasy stud like Calvin Ridley into this entire equation, the variables all help him to succeed going into this upcoming year. He's a wide receiver that in 2020, when targeted 7 or more times, was averaging nearly 18 fantasy points per game. I think he's a stud option, and I'm probably ranking him higher than just about anybody else. Moving on, let's talk about T. Higgins. T. Higgins in each of the last 2 seasons has ranked as the number 17 and number 22 overall ranked wide receiver. Now, the reason why I specifically wanted to mention this is because on yesterday's episode, in regards to wide receivers and their potential to step up and go from being a wide receiver 2 to a wide receiver 1 in a given year, we see about 2 to 3 of those, overall options every season. I think there's a very viable conversation to have in regards to T. Higgins making this jump. Again, last season, if you exclude the games in which T. Higgins got injured and left the game early, so the 3 games in which he played either 1 snap, 15% of the snaps, or 26% of the snaps, the guy was averaging 13.86 half PPR fantasy points per game in the remaining 13 games he played. Overall pace of play, 235.6 fantasy points, which would have made him the number 7 overall ranked wide receiver. The potential is there. The offense is built to throw the ball with elite level quarterback play, with Jamar Chase pulling number 1 coverage, if not double coverage every play. T. Higgins is going to get himself opportunity, whether it's, near the goal line or as a deep receiving threat. I absolutely believe that there could be the potential of T. Higgins making the top 12 push, coexisting within this offense, like we mentioned with Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle. In order to support 2 top 12 wide receivers over the course of the last 5 years, your quarterback has to have averaged about 4,600 passing yards and 32 passing touchdowns. Joe Burrow last year, 4,400 passing yards, 35 passing touchdowns. T. Higgins stays healthy for a 17-game season, easily is a top 12 option, but 14 at the base minimum. Moving on to our number 15 wide receiver, we have Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper achieved career highs last season with the Cleveland Browns in terms of targets, receiving touchdowns, and fantasy points. And when we take into account, he played majority of his games with Jacoby Brissett last season, and really Jacoby Brissett was the better quarterback on that team, really is a surprise, to be totally honest, especially when you were going from Dak Prescott in a far more superior offense in terms of passing the ball downfield to then going to the Browns, to Brissett, and still having such an incredible season, averaging 12.24 fantasy points per game. I understand that number isn't great, but when you look at how well he produced with Jacoby Brissett last season, he was averaging 13.52 fantasy points per game in the 11 games they played together, which made, throughout that span of time, Amari Cooper the 8th ranked wide receiver. While with Deshaun Watson, we saw obviously his numbers in terms of targets, receiving yards, receptions go down in terms of averages, and so did his fantasy points, averaging only 9.88 fantasy points per game and ranking as the number 23 overall wide receiver throughout that span of time. I truly do believe going into this upcoming season, we will have seen Deshaun Watson's dust kind of wear off. He didn't accumulate rust in his absence. It was rather dust. He had to brush it off. And now that he is going to help elevate Amari Cooper to having another great season. It may not be in the top 12 conversation, but still, Deshaun Watson's number one receiving options has always been fantasy relevant. You go back to 2017 through 2019 with DeAndre Hopkins. The guy was the number 5 ranked wide receiver in 2019 and the number 2 ranked wide receiver in 2018, averaging 16.3 fantasy points per game. You look at Will Fuller from 2017 through 2020, averaging 20.25 fantasy points per game throughout a 31 game span with Deshaun Watson. Incredible numbers. You look at even Brandon Cooks in 2020, from weeks 5 through 17, was averaging nearly 16 fantasy points per game and was the number 6 overall wide receiver throughout that span of time. Deshaun Watson can make receiving options relevant. The only question is, are we going to see Deshaun Watson air it out? Last season, in the couple games that he played, only averaged 28 passing attempts per game, while if you go back to 2020, had 34 passing attempts per game. I know he was a liability in the passing game, so they probably leaned away from passing rather than continuing to go back to that well. Going into 2023, he's going to be far better, and so will Amari Cooper. Moving on to DeVonta Smith, our number 16. DeVonta Smith, again, another one of these fantastic options, is going to have to compete with A.J. Brown and, of course, Dallas Goedert for a lot of targets within this offense, but yet last season was able to accomplish it, making a huge uptick, setting career highs in quite literally every stat. I mean, again, 2021, his rookie season, was the number 29 overall ranked wide receiver. Going from that to the number 10, while still being the number 2 receiving option within your offense, is incredible. DeVonta Smith last year averaged 12.18 fantasy points per game. And the fact of the matter is, if this elite level offense continues to maintain their level of production, whether it's on the ground or through the air, DeVonta Smith is going to be relevant. He's going to have opportunities to score a boatload of points. And when we have witnessed DeVonta Smith given a solid amount of targets, 7+ as of last season, when you include the playoffs and the 20 games that they played, he had 15 of those instances in which he had 7 or more targets, averaging 14.43 fantasy points per game. There's a lot of potential for DeVonta Smith to step up and have himself a great season. Having 2 wide receivers coexist within the top 12 rankings, again, like I've mentioned multiple times on today's episode, whether it's in regards to the Miami Dolphins receivers or the Cincinnati Bengals, it's going to take your quarterback averaging about 4,600 passing yards and 32 passing touchdowns. Last season, the quarterbacks for the Philadelphia Eagles combined for 4,300 passing yards and 25 passing touchdowns. It is going to be difficult, in my opinion, for DeVonta Smith to once again retain a top 12 standing. It's not out of the realm of possibility. It's just going to be a little bit more difficult with Goddard being fully healthy, with DeAndre Swift now in this offense, garnering receptions. Therefore, DeVonta Smith, a fantastic talent, sits at 16. Moving on to DK Metcalf. If DK Metcalf can take on, Jackson Smith and Jigba joining this offense and obviously garnering a bunch of targets, if he can take on the fact that Tyler Lockett is probably still going to see himself over 100 targets and still maintain a top 16, 17, 18 standing, it'll be fantastic. I mean, last year, with the overall opportunity that he was given, was the number 18 overall wide receiver in fantasy. The year prior to that was number 12. The year prior to that was number 7. In terms of fantasy production, he has declined over the last 3 years, and I don't see him declining once again. I think what he was able to accomplish last year is very much so repeatable. I mean, last season achieved career highs in targets and receptions, so the opportunities are certainly there. And we're talking about a quarterback like Geno Smith, who was number 1 amongst all quarterbacks last season in terms of passing completion percentage, which I think was 69.8%, incredible number. On top of the fact that this is a deep ball receiving threat, a guy who can catch the ball 20 yards plus down the field. You saw how well Geno Smith was able to transition into this offense and help them elevate to another level. I think there's a potential in which DK Metcalf, who with Geno Smith since 2021 has averaged 21.71 fantasy points per game when you include the playoffs as well, could go ahead and just maintain his value. Maintain a very similar level of production in terms of receptions, receiving yards, finding himself in the end zone within an offense that, yes, there's going to be a little bit more competition, but with that, it's already baked in to his current ranking. Moving on to our number 18, we have Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen has been, yes, getting older, and the injuries have been catching up, but if he can maintain his health, this is a guy that in 2020 and in 2021 was the number 14 ranked wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format. When healthy, last season was averaging 15.04 fantasy points per game in 8 healthy games. Since 2020, has averaged 14.36 fantasy points per game in the 35 contests that he has had Justin Herbert as a starting quarterback. There is so much potential for Keenan Allen to have himself another incredible season here. As you switch from Joe Lombardi being the offensive coordinator to now having Kellen Moore there, we saw how much utilization, of course, CeeDee Lamb saw from the slot position. Of course, that's exactly where Keenan Allen resides and finds majority of his production. We should end up seeing another incredible year from Keenan Allen, assuming he's on the field and assuming he's healthy. Since 2020, we have seen Keenan Allen produce 28 games of 10 or more fantasy points and only 7 games of less than 10 fantasy points. He is a consistent option, And with Justin Herbert continuing to improve every year, I believe Keenan Allen is very easily a top 18 wide receiver. Let's move on to the final stretch of wide receivers we wanted to mention. Beginning with our number 19, we have Tyler Lockett. Again, the Seattle Seahawks offense can sustain supporting 2 top 24 wide receivers. Again, in order to do so, your quarterback typically needs to average about 4,500 passing yards and about 30 passing touchdowns. Last season, Geno Smith, 4,300 passing yards nearly and 30 passing touchdowns. So he's in that conversation. He could very easily support 2 top 24 wide receivers. Tyler Lockett has been consistent and could very easily crush this number and probably will, because it's just what he does every year. That's just what he does. The last 5 seasons has ranked as the number 13, 13, 9, 14, and 5 overall ranked wide receiver in fantasy football. Has played 127 of his eligible 130 games of his career. Has scored 45 receiving touchdowns in the last 80 regular season games that he has played. And last season averaged 12.21 fantasy points per game in the 16 games that he played. I can't see an argument in which Tyler Lockett completely falls off the top 24 conversation unless Jackson Smith and Jigba completely supplant him in that conversation. If he immediately joins the team and garners himself over 100 targets, then sure, we're going to see ourselves a little bit of trouble with Tyler Lockett retaining this value. But then again, this is a team that's going to throw the ball a boatload of times. And if you can spread it within your 3 receiving options, I think you could still find yourself Tyler Lockett maintaining a top 24 standing, a wide receiver who was 10th amongst all in the National Football League last year in terms of passer rating when targeted with 114.2. I think Tyler Lockett is just far too consistent for me to drop him any lower on my rankings. Therefore, he maintains as the number 19. Moving on to Jerry Jeudy, our number 20. So here's the thing about Jerry Jeudy. Tim Patrick for the 2nd consecutive season, off-season injury. I believe he tore his Achilles the other day. Very unfortunate, but this is just going to continue to give Jerry Jeudy more opportunity because outside of Sutton, Dulcich, the backfield getting some receptions, and maybe Marvin Mims, there really doesn't seem like much competition for targets in regards to Jerry Jeudy. And when you're associated with a Sean Payton offense, the offense suggests a potential Mike Thomas role in the upcoming season. And when we specifically isolate the games in which Jerry Jeudy was healthy last season, weeks 1 through 8, the games in which he was healthy and played 60% or more of the offensive snaps, averaged 12.27 fantasy points per game. And then additionally, after he returned from his injury, from weeks 13 through 18, 60+% of the snaps, averaged 16.68 fantasy points per game. All in all, he can be a relevant wide receiver. There really isn't anyone else within this offense to compete with him and deny him of those opportunities. And if Russell Wilson takes an incredible step forward in comparison to 2021, which won't be difficult considering how awful he played last season, I very easily think that Jerry Jeudy is a top 24 option. And we have seen Russell Wilson in seasons past with Seattle support not only top 24 options, 2 of them within a singular season, but he also used to support DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett as both top 12 options. So there is a potential in which Jerry Jeudy can elevate his game alongside Russell Wilson. And when they both do so, be a fantastic option going into the 2023 season. Moving on to number 21, we have Christian Watson. Christian Watson is a very special player. Last season, weeks 1 through 9, averaged 3.62 fantasy points per game. Turned it around from weeks 10 through 18 when given ample opportunity and averaged 15.24 fantasy points per game. And was the number 7 overall wide receiver throughout that span of time. Certainly helped out all of our fantasy teams for those of us who were able to either have drafted him and were able to hold on to him from weeks 1 through 9, or were able to attack the waiver wire and pick him up. He defied all the odds within the Green Bay Packers offense and was a relevant rookie wide receiver, ranking number 34 amongst all wide receivers last season. We hadn't seen that in forever since Aaron Rodgers had been the quarterback of that team. Yet he was asked to step up to the task at hand and delivered in games in which Christian Watson had 6 or more targets last year. 7 of his 14 games in which he participated in, he was averaging 17.19 fantasy points per game. Incredible overall production. In games in which he had 80% of the offensive snaps played or more, 6 contests in terms of those instances, he was averaging 18.73 fantasy points per game. The production's there. The opportunity will certainly be there because there is a vacancy of targets that is pretty high number, 224, with no Lazard, no Cobb, no Mercedes Lewis, no Robert Tonyan. Opportunities are up for grabs. And even with Jordan Love taking over at the quarterback position, I truly do believe as long as Christian Watson maintains the number 1 receiving option of this team, which he absolutely will, alongside probably, the couple sprinkles that Romeo Doubs will be exposed to, I truly do believe that Christian Watson will find himself a very successful season here. A wide receiver that was number 11 amongst all in terms of yards per route run with 2.26. Again, you got to remember, he was the number 34 ranked wide receiver last season with only 66 targets. 9 touchdowns certainly helped, but I certainly think that when everything levels out, the touchdowns probably regress a little bit. I mean, if they maintain and everything else increases, he's going to certainly crush the number 21 spot. Moving on to our number 22, we have Mike Williams. Mike Williams is associated with an offense that, in my opinion, should be able to take steps forward with Kellen Moore joining the organization as a new offensive coordinator with a healthy receiving core, offensive line, and quarterback. Obviously, of course, Justin Herbert was dealing with that rib injury last year. If everyone's healthy, including Mike Williams himself, who missed a fair share amount of games last season, they should be a productive bunch. Last season, in healthy games, Mike Williams was averaging 12.5 fantasy points per game. Weeks 1 through 7, 12.3 fantasy points per game, was the number 9 overall wide receiver throughout that span of time. And from weeks 14 through 17, when healthy, was averaging 12.95 fantasy points per game and was the number 15. I truly do believe when you give this man opportunity, he can deliver. He has shown that he can absolutely be a top 10 option. He accomplished that in 2021. He has also proven to us that he can be very inconsistent. That's why he's at this lower end conversation of the wide receiver 2 position, because he will be inconsistent. You bring in guys like Quentin Johnston, who obviously take away some opportunities, pretty much a mini version of Mike Williams for the future, who will have to sit back and learn from the veteran options within this team. But if this offense continues to unlock itself, they open up the deep passing game, which they really haven't allowed Justin Herbert to take advantage of in the last couple of years, and they let Mike Williams cook. I truly do believe it is going to be a very eventful season for the Los Angeles Chargers receiving corps, but specifically Mike Williams. Moving on, we have Deebo Samuel at number 23. I'm hard-pressed to think that Deebo Samuel could very easily crush this number, but I'm also in the frame of mind with Brock Purdy returning, and when you have Christian McCaffrey garnering for targets, George Kittle within this offense, and Brandon Ayuk, it is going to be difficult to see Deebo Samuel get a high volume of targets. And sure, he doesn't need a high volume of targets. In the last 2 seasons, when he has gotten 7 or more targets in a singular game, the guy's averaging 15 fantasy points per game, 18 of the 28 games that he's participated in within the last 2 seasons, which is a 64% rate. Again, you don't have to get him the ball every single game 7+ times, but if you do, it's going to lead to success more often than not. Again, this offseason, we've heard the conversations regarding Deebo Samuel's overall health and the fact that he has been quoted to have said, "This is the best playing shape that I've been in since 2019. We've seen John Lynch and, of course, Kyle Shanahan mention that Deebo's taking this season really seriously. He was really distracted last season with the contract and all that was, and wasn't healthy for the full year. If we can get a full healthy Deebo Samuel, of course, he has the potential of being a top 23, if not top 12 receiving option. He's demonstrated that in the past. I mean, the last 2 games we saw it with, Deebo Samuel and Brock Purdy playing together in the playoffs. One of those games, 6 catches, 133 and a touchdown for 25.5 fantasy points. The other, 4 catches, 45, no touchdown, 7.6 fantasy points. That's what I'm expecting to see. High levels of production, but probably a lot of inconsistency considering how many receiving options are within this offense going forward, and the fact that I expect to see Brandon Ayuk continue to make trends and steps towards being an even better receiver in 2023. The final option we have here is DJ Moore. DJ Moore is the newest member of the Chicago Bears, and the fact of the matter is, in each of the last 4 seasons, he has been ranked as the number 18, 22, 19, and 22 ranked wide receiver in fantasy football, while having 8 different starting quarterbacks throughout that span of time, consisting of, and let's go through this list, Cam Newton, Taylor Heineke, Kyle Allen, Will Grier, Teddy Bridgewater, PJ Walker, and Sam Darnold. And also Baker Mayfield. Let's not forget, there have been a lot of quarterbacks within this organization. They've all played terribly. Are any of those guys better than Justin Fields? Can Justin Fields take that 3rd-year leap and be significantly better than these receiving options? Absolutely. And even if he's not, we still expect to see DJ Moore probably be a top 24 option. Therefore, he stays in this conversation within an offense that needs a number 1 receiving option, who were extremely lacking from receiving depth with Darnell Mooney and, of course, Chase Claypool not pulling any weight last year. Obviously, we can take into account the fact that Justin Fields didn't play well, especially weeks 1 through 4, where he was averaging 8.5 completions per game, while later in the season, obviously, those numbers increased to about 15 completions per game on average. If we see Justin Fields another year within this offense, within this scheme, getting more comfortable, DJ Moore as the number 1 receiving option of this offense, I'm a guy that in the last 63 regular season games that he has played averages about 11.48 fantasy points per game, but when given ample opportunity, can certainly rise above that. I mean, you just look at late last season, the fantasy playoffs, weeks 15 through 17. DJ Moore was a fantasy league winner, averaging 18 fantasy points throughout that 3-game span with Sam Darnold at quarterback. I think the sky's the limit for DJ Moore, associated with Justin Fields, who's going to take another step forward in the passing game this season. But that's going to cover for me today. Again, thank you everybody for watching. If you guys haven't yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Later tonight, I will be live streaming here on the channel. Probably you're just going to have to wait and see the notification rather than wait and watch this entire video, because it is difficult. But if you do end up seeing the the back end of this video, be sure to comment down below. I greatly appreciate your guys' support. Click the like button. Also, don't forget, like I've mentioned already, if you guys haven't yet already taken advantage of the opportunity on hand, use promo code Andrew via Underdog Fantasy. Get my 2023 fantasy football draft guide, my 2023 fantasy football weeks 1 through 18 rankings sent to you from my email to yours every single Sunday morning. All you got to do, sign up using code Andrew and make that first time deposit minimum of $10. Be sure to go ahead, draft responsibly, and take advantage of the rankings that I send you and draft some teams. Get some experience under your belt so we can help you win some 2023 fantasy football championships. Until tomorrow, thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you guys. Peace.